So it's Judy Ridner, and I'm here today with Mr. Larry Box, and it's February 5th, 2016, and we're here in Starkville. So, Mr. Box, I was wondering if we could just start by talking a little bit about your background, about where you grew up and how you got to Starkville, and a little bit about your family history.
Okay. My mother and father were public school educators. My father was a school administrator during the real years that I remember, that part of my life. Both of them graduates of Mississippi State. Okay. Even though my father did get one degree at Ole Miss, we all have forgiven him for that. And my connection with Starkville began at an early age. My dad was invited for a number of summers to come to Mississippi State and teach in the School of Education in the summertime. So we would come to Starkville and live, and then go back to wherever he might be the principal or superintendent. Most of my life it was in Calhoun County, Mississippi. Then in 1959, he was offered a position here in the College of Education, and he continued to work in the College of Ed until his death in the mid-70s. At the time he was Associate Dean of the College of Education. So I actually graduated from Starkville High School in 1962. Got a athletic scholarship to play basketball at East Mississippi Community College. So I did that for 2 years, then came on to Mississippi State and graduated with a degree in math education in 1966. Did my student teaching at Lee High School in Columbus, and at the end of that time they offered me a job teaching in Columbus. So I taught math in Columbus public schools for 2 years.
From like 66 maybe to 68.
66 to 68. And in the spring of 68, I was offered a job teaching mathematics at Starkville High School. So I taught 2 years at Starkville High, and then I became principal of Sudeth Elementary School in the summer of 1970, which was also the summer of the desegregation of the Starkville schools. So I continued at Sudeth until 1981, and then I moved to Henderson Junior High School, where I was principal there, and in 1985, I guess, I became assistant superintendent of Starkville schools. And then in 1990, I became superintendent and served in that capacity until I retired in 2002.
So, so you have a lot of experience with the Starkville schools in various capacities. So I'm thinking about how would you describe your experiences at Starkville High in the late 50s and early 60s when you went there? What do you remember about Starkville High?
The high school was the 1920s building that's currently called the Greensboro Center. Like most teenage boys, I was totally into sports. Met my current wife when we were a typical high school sweetheart type thing. So it was time with her and playing sports and doing the best you could academically. That was sort of what I remember.
And did you have an aspiration to be a teacher at that point in time when you were in high school?
I thought about it, and I had a truly outstanding mathematics teacher, Mrs. Hodges, who was just an outstanding teacher, and I'd grown up in a family of educators, so I thought, well, I want to be a math teacher, and so that's what I did.
Yeah, and so Starkville High at that point, because I do know the Greensboro Center, it's not a very big building. I mean, do you have any memory of what the size of your graduating class was? How big or how small was Starkville High?
It was over 100 in our class, maybe 115 or so. The whole high school, I think grades 8 through 12 were there. So it was probably no more than 2,000. Well, it wouldn't be that many.
Yeah. It's a small building.
Yeah.
Yeah. And compared to where you had been in Calhoun County, how did Starkville compare when you came here in the 1959? How did it compare?
Well, it's quite different. The towns in Calhoun County then were all very small. The high school I went to there as a freshman, I'm guessing probably had 75 or so students in the whole 9 through 12. I may be wrong, but I remember it being very small.
Yeah.
So it was somewhat different to come to Starkville. Teenagers fit in when they have a place to fit, and athletics was my thing, primarily basketball and baseball, and so it was a fairly smooth transition, even though it was a much bigger school.
And are there any things that stand out in your mind about the town when you got here in the late 50s and early 60s? About what it was like, or where you went and what you did?
Yeah, much smaller, of course. Interestingly enough, those of us on the high school basketball team could go by the coach's house, ask for a key to the gym, being given that key, go over and just play basketball at night, weekends, summertime, just have pickup games and have total access to the gym, get through, lock it up, take the key back. Then we would go to on University Drive where Bulldog Deli is now, if you're familiar with that. There was and we call it Pyron's. I assume that's who owned it, but it's a typical dairy bar where you could go by and get a milkshake and talk before you went home. Just a very different time compared to now.
Yeah, very small. It sounds very small town.
Was very much.
Yeah.
All of Highway 12 from Jackson Street all the way out of town, there was a radio station on the south side of Highway 12, and that was about all the way out to the 4-lane at Walmart. There was nothing on the south side of 12. And Green Oaks subdivision, if you know where that is, that was the new subdivision in town. There was no houses, nothing on west of that. It was, a very much smaller place in 1960 than it is now.
And how would you have, when you say smaller, how would you have described the community feel at the time when you got here?
Very supportive of whatever was going on in the community. Pretty tightly mixed group. There was the town and gown distinction. It was not in any way hostile, but there was a difference. Everybody recognized the town group and the university group, but they interacted well so far as being a teenager that I know.
That's good. And you said that both of your parents, obviously when you came here to Starkville, your father was working for the university, but your mother was also a public school teacher. Did she work as well when she came?
She did, in Starkville schools. And in fact, special education was just becoming recognized as a need in public schools, and she was one of the first, if not maybe the first, special education teacher in Starkville. Later went back to teaching second grade, but when we moved here, she taught special education.
And what school, did she teach at one of the schools, or was she just, did she rotate around?
She, I don't remember, I guess she started at Sudduth, and then went to Overstreet, those two elementary schools.
Okay. Now I noticed too, graduated from MSU in 1966, so you would have been here when MSU integrated. And I was wondering if you have any memory of that happening. You would have probably been, let's see, you would have been here you would have been a student here during the Game of Change, and then when Richard Holmes he enrolls in the summer of '65, and I was wondering, do you have any memory of that?
I remember it happening.
Uh-huh.
I remember it being so much calmer and less eventful than what happened at Ole Miss.
Yeah.
Beyond that, it doesn't stand out because it wasn't a really big event.
Yeah.
I remember the basketball game you're referring to. Remember actually being happy and proud that we played it, because I didn't think we should be denied the opportunity.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I understand. Do you ever remember seeing Richard Holmes on campus while you were here?
I do not. I recognize him now when I see him, but I do not recall having seen him on campus.
And do you ever remember, since he's also grew up mostly in Starkville, do you ever remember seeing him around town? Like, you two would have been really similar ages. Do you remember having?
Do not. Yeah, and that's an interesting phenomenon. I worked with 2 or 3 people in the Starkville schools who were my age. One of them in particular, Dr. James Smith, we were the same age. When I was superintendent, he was assistant. I'm white, he's black. And we talked about, we never knew about each other when we were growing up.
Yeah.
It was just 2 different communities.
Yeah. And right, which is so interesting in such a small town. But yeah, because you very much follow that parallel of Richard Holmes. He's here at the same time. Really interesting. Do you have any sense, you mentioned Ole Miss, so how conscious were you as a college student of what had happened at Ole Miss, and then how much did that influence your perceptions of what happened here? Like, were you aware of what had happened at Ole Miss with the riots?
Very much. And radio and television and news coverage was my only source of information. I certainly did not go up there and see any of it. But I knew it was very turbulent, and you know, lives lost and a lot of violence. So I knew all that happened, and I was pleased it didn't happen here. That's about the extent of what I recall about it all.
And do you remember your parents talking about these events, or even your father as somebody who had worked his way up into administration here? Do you remember him talking much about integration at MSU?
No, I don't. I really don't. One interesting tidbit about integration and his interaction, probably 8 or 10 years ago, I had a retired professor. Well, there's more than that because I was still superintendent. There was an activist here named Dr. Morris Kinsey, who was very much an activist in the black community. I had a gentleman tell me and smile and say, I don't know if you know or not, talking to me, but he said there was a committee of people who interviewed Dr. Kinsey to bring him to Mississippi State. He was here on campus for a while as a professor in a position here. And he said, your daddy was one of the people that picked him during the interview and recommended that he come to Mississippi State. My daddy never told me that, but in terms of anything about integration, that's the only little tidbit I have.
That's funny.
That might.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's the Kinsey who did the Kinsey collection that was here. No, it's a different Kinsey. Okay.
The Kinsey did a collection, West Coast.
Okay.
Totally different people.
Okay. Okay. So, how about if we then talk about your years of teaching and being principal? So, what do you remember about coming? Well, what do you remember about coming back to Starkville? You had been away, obviously, for a couple of years teaching in Columbus, and then you come back as a teacher, and then pretty soon thereafter, you're a principal at Sedith. What do you remember about coming back to the school system at that point in time as a professional, as a teacher, and then as a principal? What were the schools like that you came back to?
Well, the building was entirely different. While I was gone, they built the high school that's now on Louisville Street. So the setting was different. Probably 2/3 of the faculty were teaching at Starkville High when I was a student. So that was interesting to be back in that relationship where I was now a teacher and they had taught me, some of them. Some of the coaches had coached me and were still there, that type thing. So that was unique. Beyond that, it was just typical being a high school teacher, I guess.
When you say typical being a high school teacher, what does that mean?
You never, adolescents mature in ups and downs. It's kind of like the stock market. They'll mature and then they'll go back and do something. You wonder why did they do that, and then they'll mature a little bit more over time, and then their highs and lows continue to go up. So I like just being a typical teacher.
Now, in the new building, had Starkville High's classes gotten larger by that point in time? Since they built that new structure, it would suggest that there was some kind of demand for more space.
It was.
Although maybe that wasn't so.
Some bigger, but not a lot. And let me go back and correct something I said earlier about that. I did the multiplication of students twice. We had 100 and something in our class, and so there were 400 or 500 people in Starkville High School, not that 2,000. I multiplied that out twice in my mind to get 2,000. But by the late 60s, there were a few more, but the classes still were probably 125 or so, something like that, 130 maybe.
Okay. And did you have any sense as a teacher that there was a push, even by the late 60s, that African Americans in the community were starting to kind of agitate to push for school integration? Did you have any sense of that? And do you have any sense of kind of what the thinking was and what the attitude was at the time towards that issue? As you came back, again, this would be like...
It was talked about. There was news more at a national level than locally. There was certainly talk at the state level coming out of the political side of our state. So the issue of the schools are looking at desegregation was there. I don't remember any activism type issues locally. I'm sure there was some there. What I do remember the very first vestiges maybe of integration. There was, and I think the push came from the U.S. Justice Department, but there was a procedure put in place where students could move from a school where they were in the minority race to the majority, and we had, I'm pretty sure it was my first year at Starkville High, I know by the second, we had a very small number of black students in Starkville High School.
Yeah.
I taught algebra and geometry, and I had a number of them. By that I mean 6 or 8, maybe 10, something like that. Most of them were very good students.
Yeah.
A few of them struggled, but most of them were very good.
Yeah. Did you have any sense of who those African American students were in terms of their families or their backgrounds?
Yeah.
And can you give me some sense of who they were?
Children, for the most part, of the black business people in town. We had a black doctor who, I think that's my.
I was going
to say. Let me turn.
I thought you said the camera.
A black doctor who had, in fact, he was connected to Richard Holmes too.
Yeah, Dr. Holmes. Dr. Connor. Excuse me,
Connor.
Dr. Connor. Misspeaking.
Had.
Yeah, his daughters, I think, were in that.
Pardon?
At least one of his daughters went to Starkville High.
Yes,
before.
I taught her.
Yeah, okay.
I taught her in my geometry class. Very good student. So I knew their families, didn't know them well, but I recognized whose children they were.
Right.
For the most part, there were 1 or 2 that I did not know anything about them, but most of them I knew whose families they were.
Do you have any sense, as a teacher, I know it would be more difficult, but do you have any sense of how these students fared in Starkville High, being, such a tiny group of minority students in this, mostly white school? Do you have any sense of how they did, or how they handled the situation?
I really don't. When I think back, they tended to sit more or less together in my class. I did not have assigned seats. 1 or 2 sat by themselves, but they tended to be together in my class. And beyond that, I do not know. I don't remember.
Yeah. Did you have any sense of tension? Did you have any sense of hostility? Can you describe maybe the mood of your classroom when these new students arrived?
Yeah, I don't remember it being a tense or a difficult situation. I suppose you'd get a better answer to that question to ask them. But so far as an incident in my class or my classes involving them, or where they were the center of an issue, I don't remember that. I don't think it happened. I certainly don't remember it.
Can you give me some sense of how, since you taught in Columbus for 2 years, how the 2 school systems compared as a teacher? So you taught in Columbus, then you came back to Starkville. Can you give me any sense of how they were the same or how they were different?
I don't remember anything standing out that struck me as, hey, this is different in either direction. I mean, it was just, I just have no recollection of anything that would stand out.
Did Columbus seem more urban than Starkville at that point in time?
It was bigger, of course, but not enough that it was big city versus little city type stuff. No.
Okay. So thinking about that kind of pivotal year of 1970, when you went to Sudeth as a principal, and that's the year, as you said, where there really was a mandate from the courts ultimately that Starkville had to desegregate its schools. Can you give us any sense of what you remember from that year, what that was like, how you, since you had moved from teacher to principal, now you're sort of helping to lead this transition on many levels, what that was like?
I will do that. There's one bit of information in particular I think would be good for me to share before that.
Sure. Go ahead.
In the 1969-70 school year, the decision came, and I don't know, I suspect it was federal court order or Justice Department. I don't think it was local. It could have been local to facilitate the 1970 total desegregation. I don't know where the...
It was a court order.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I know the 70 was a court order, but what I'm talking about in the spring of 69, we had integration of staff and faculty. And
Yeah.
so along about Thanksgiving, there began to be discussions of how are we going to mix teachers.
Good to know. Yeah.
And the ultimate decision came down to a game of chance.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, thank you for, the teachers we've spoken to talk about this too.
About the bingo machine?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So some of them were selected too, so they knew, but so I don't guess I need to go into that.
Oh, no, talk about it. It would be interesting to hear it from another perspective. So they really did have like a bingo, like
Yes.
lottery machine.
Yes. An example being, let's say they needed to select 2 second grade teachers who were white and 2 second grade teachers who were black, and have them swap classrooms over Christmas holidays. They would take all of the white second grade teachers, and based on their number of years of teaching, assign them a bingo ball. So if you were a teacher and the longer you've been teaching, the fewer balls you got to put in the machine. So if you were a first year teacher, you might, I don't remember, you might have 4 or 5 bingo balls put in the machine, and a teacher with 30 years experience only had 1, and they'd put all of them in there and turn the thing on, and whatever assigned ball came out, that's who was picked. And that's how they decided who would go. And thinking back to some of the people you talked to, some of them were selected too.
Yes, they were.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were. And they were all, we were struck by how they had all just started. Most of them had just, Carmen Knott, she had been here at least a few years, but the other two, Rosemary and Pam, were both very new teachers.
They had a lot more balls in the machine.
They did. And I've actually also been reading school board minutes, and it's outlined in the school board minutes. And it is indeed what you sort of described, that they kind of outline like the number of kind of chances you would be given. And it was, based on seniority, you were much more likely to go if you were a young teacher who had just arrived. And they, with the exception of Carmen, the 3 of them were mostly very young, new teachers. And they went over to Henderson. So it's, now do you have any sense of why, especially because you were just moving in to the spot of being a principal? Well, I guess this would have still been while you were a teacher. I take that back.
Yes, this happened while I was a teacher at Starkville High.
Do you have any sense of what inspired them to do this? Were other school systems doing this? Who came up with the idea?
I have no idea. I do not know. I have no idea. It was kind of a unique way, and I suppose they viewed it as a very fair way. But I do not know who designed the plan.
Yeah, it is. It's I haven't heard of it happening other places, but that isn't to say that it didn't. Yeah, it's real interesting. Do you have any sense too of what was the motivation between integrating the faculty before the students?
Well, as I said earlier, I don't know if it was a local decision to try to facilitate integration or if it was a push from the Justice Department or a court order. I don't know what brought that on. Now, I know for sure that the desegregation of 1970 was a federal court order, but I do not know what prompted the faculty integration in the spring of '69.
Do you think it made sense to integrate the faculty before the students?
Well, I do. When I look back on it, it was a very practical way to expose the two communities to each other in a very small way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was not, by no means did it, and I don't know how they decided how many of each teaching category would, but it was a fraction of the total number of people.
Yeah.
It wasn't. We didn't end up with all schools being a 50-50 mix of races. It was not that massive. So I don't know. To answer your question, I really don't know.
Do you, when you say it wasn't a 50-50 mix, can you give me any idea of what the mix was? Just approximate.
I would say no more than 15-20% maybe of black teachers being in what was white schools and white ones in black schools.
Okay.
And I could be wrong a little bit, but it was
Right.
not a lot.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, neat. Okay, so we talked about integration of the faculty. So then the next year, and you stayed, and I should say, obviously you did not get picked.
I did
to
not
go.
get picked.
So
No.
you stayed at Starkville High.
Yeah, had balls in the machine, but I didn't get
But you
picked.
did not. Right. Now, did your, oh no, your classes would have stayed the same. Take back that question. So then the next year, you obviously move up into administration, and the court order is mandating desegregation of the schools.
That's true.
And if I understand it correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it started mostly with the high schools, and then it worked its way down to the elementary schools. Is that correct?
No.
Or were all schools?
It was
So even at
total-
Sudduth, it was total change.
Change over the summer of 1970.
Okay. And so what was that like? For you, obviously there'd be two changes. You were going to a new job, and you were facing a different school dynamic. What was that like?
A lot of uncertainty, as you would expect. Had no idea if it was going to be a smooth integration. Had the normal, you might even say anxiety, I guess, beginning principal would have. So it was a time of uncertainty for me. But when I look back at it, it was probably as smooth as it could have been. It was everybody, black staff, white staff, black students, white students. You wondered what might happen, what will happen. Didn't want to have a massive civil uprising because of it, but it went really smoothly, considering what people feared, I guess would be the way to say it. I mean, it was imagine now there were two white elementary schools, and the campus at Henderson was a black complex, and down 25 where Emerson Family School is, that was a black school. So you had to, over the summer, everybody, we hired kids and administrators, everybody was really into the physical process of moving everything. You had to go get all the, well, let me say something else you probably know, but it enters into this, and it was a good decision at the time. In order to, how do I say this? In order to keep from having pockets, having neighborhood schools and pockets of the town that were viewed as the best school, the best place to go, and our local board and superintendent worked through the courts to get the court order to be that all students in a grade would be housed in the same building. So we ended up with Overstreet School having first and second grades. Down at Emerson on 25 was third grade. Ward School over on the Henderson Complex was fourth grade. Sudeth Elementary was fifth grade.
Okay.
Armstrong was 6 and 7.
Okay.
Rosa Stewart and Henderson High School on the Henderson campus were 8 and 9. And Starkville High was 10, 11, 12. So I was the principal of Sudeth School, which was a fifth grade. Fifth grade. So my responsibility was to get all the fifth grade materials in the whole district, black and white, get them over to that school, get them set up, get teachers assigned. So when I say we had a lot of physical, we had high school kids helping and all, but we did a tremendous amount of moving things around. Every principal did to get it set up and get it ready to go throughout the summer.
Sure. And that explains, I had not necessarily realized that, but it explains what a couple of people we've talked to have said about, well, I went to this school and I went to that school and I went to, describing how they're getting moved around, and it was not fully, they were not fully clear on why that had happened, and now I understand.
It was a good move at the time. Everybody felt like they were being treated equally. If you're going to be in third grade, you go there. If you go first grade, you go here.
Right.
And there wasn't. It was just a good thing. Now it has become, because the city has grown so. Yeah. It's become more difficult to manage, and the question has to be asked at some point is, for example, Sudeth Elementary School as large as it should be. Can we just keep putting, currently they're kindergarten, first and second there, I guess. Okay. Can we just keep adding those children there and making that school bigger and bigger, or are we going to finally have to build another school? Mm-hmm. But for the almost 50 years that it served us well, it was a good decision to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I understand now. It's about getting away from that neighborhood school, an argument that was pretty powerful in terms of helping to kind of continue to perpetuate segregation. Yeah. Makes sense. Oh, makes sense. I had not realized it. So, let's see. What was it also like? Obviously, you said that it's uncertain to go from being a teacher to an administrator. What else was it like as part of that transition going from teacher to administrator? Obviously, you faced huge challenges in terms of completely kind of reconfiguring the school you had just arrived at. Were there any other challenges you faced as a new administrator? And how supportive was the district also of your role suddenly as going from teacher to administrator?
Well, I had the beginning administrator concerned, many of the teachers were much older than I was. So I had to supervise, if that's the right word, or administer in a diplomatic fashion, I thought, in order to keep them from thinking, what's this young whippersnapper doing telling me this, you know. Yeah. So I tried to analyze how they would view me and then act appropriately, shall I say. Mm-hmm. I don't remember any real issues. I mean, there were always issues. Talking to a teacher, I wished that hadn't happened, you know, and we'd work our way through it. But I don't remember any making a newspaper type issues, type things, you know.
And what had inspired you to become an administrator?
I really don't know. I mean, I saw my father do it. And for men in particular, it was sort of a transgression. That's not the right word. It was sort of a career path because there was a difference in pay. You know, if you were a teacher versus an administrator, and being a man, you just sort of thought, I'll teach a while and then I'll become an administrator. Yeah. Yeah. And I became one at a very young age. I mean,
I was going to say.
I taught for 4 years, so I was in my early 20s when I became principal.
Yeah, and you had, at that point you had only a BS degree. So now were you also?
No, I had, while I was teaching in both Columbus and Starkville, I came back to Mississippi State and got a master's in administration. So I'd been working toward that. Yeah. In fact, the very first summer after my first year of teaching, I enrolled in graduate school.
Yeah. So you were headed along an administrative trend. That's interesting. Thinking too about that 1970 year. A couple of people we've talked to one person in particular really credited the school superintendent with helping to make this a smooth transition to desegregate the schools. Are there any things you remember about, if I understand and I've got all my facts correct, right around 1969, 70, 71, it's Hal Buchanan is the school superintendent, and then shortly thereafter, I think Paul Armstrong takes over.
Right.
So, do you have any thoughts on, or do you have any memories about the school superintendent at the time and how he was approaching this prospect of desegregating the whole district and really, remaking the schools in many respects?
No, not really. While I was teaching at Starkville High, Hal Buchanan was the superintendent. And I'm reasonably certain Paul Armstrong was named superintendent during the spring of 1970, so that he was facing somewhat the same issues I was. That his first real year of being a superintendent was the year we desegregated.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But I don't recall. I don't recall any. We had a couple of faculty meetings where he was up and talking to try to explain what was going to happen, how things were. So he was good about keeping people informed. Mm-hmm. Buchanan was when this was about to happen, but I don't recall him. I guess if you say he facilitated and made it go easier, it's because he kept us informed, maybe.
Well, do you agree with that assessment from other people that he somehow eased this transition?
I'm sure he did. I don't know that I would have thought of bringing it up as a point. but I'm sure he did.
Do you have any sense of what was the attitude generally of administrators to this whole prospect of desegregating the schools, and what specific things were you all thinking about were the real challenges of this process?
A lot of us were first timers. Not there was one other. The principal at Emerson, he was like I. The first day he was a principal was integration. The others had experience, but there were a couple of others who were new to the system. The principal at Overstreet had moved from Vicksburg that summer. Principal at Ward School had come from Knoxville County. So we were all, a high percentage of the administrators, first timers in the Starkville School being an administrator. So we were all dealing with that experience, I guess, and just hoping that we didn't have a major problem.
Yeah. Do you think being new was an advantage or disadvantage?
I don't know. I'm not sure that it mattered either way.
So after that first year, what were things like?
May I go back and talk about one other thing?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you tell me.
The superintendent that you mentioned, Buchanan, during his time and before, it was probably the 69-70 school year, it was decided that all teachers would take the graduate record examination. And by that I mean all, black and white, everybody. There was a cut score established, and anyone who scored below that was terminated. A group of teachers who were terminated sued the school district. It took that a while to work its way through the court system. The school district lost the court case. The teachers won. As I recall, the major reason that the school district lost was that they had chosen to use the graduate record exam because there was no data to support the position that being able to pass the graduate record exam meant you were a good teacher. And the issue came up, why did you select the graduate record exam rather than the National Teachers Exam, which was designed to measure good teaching? And the district did not have a good answer for that. So those, and I don't remember, my wife and I were talking about that. I remembered there were 18 people in the court case. She thought about 8 or 10. I don't know how many. Very small number. But they were given their jobs back. Some of them opted not to take it after they won the case. Some did. Probably by the time that was all over, we'd been in school as an integrated school for a year, maybe 2. At Sudeth, I was assigned one of those teachers. We met the first time in the office, and he said all I wanted was to stay in Starkville and have my job. He said, I'm not here to cause any trouble, I just want to teach. And he was the perfect example of how not doing well on the graduate record in no way indicates what kind of teacher you are, because he was outstanding. Worked in the system for many years, and at Sudeth School right now, if you go back behind the campus, you find a walking track that's named for him. He was just an outstanding person.
Do you remember his name? by any chance?
Yes, Tiny, Tinnie, Collier.
Collier. Yeah.
Mhm.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah, I have not seen a thorough explanation of why they picked the GRE. I have not seen that. You know, we're still working on this project, so I don't have the answers to everything by any means. But I have not seen why that was picked. Yeah, that's interesting, and it's interesting that you got one of those teachers back, and that obviously you went on and taught there for
He was outstanding.
years afterwards.
He was outstanding.
Yeah, interesting. That's really interesting. Now, are there other, I don't mean to so direct the interview. Are there other things that you're remembering from that time period that you want to talk about that occur to you that I may have missed or not even, I don't even know about everything?
Nothing comes to my mind at the moment. The big things were the desegregation order, the integration of faculty ahead of time, the court case. Now the district also was involved in, I guess the remaining item I might remember. There was some concern among the powers that be, and this is still in the late 60s, about there may be a wide range of aptitude, maybe, achievement, maybe, whatever word somebody might want to use that the board and the superintendent were worried about, but that in a typical third grade class, the student range of achievement would be so wide that teachers couldn't handle it. So all of the children were given achievement tests, recognized national achievement tests, and based on their score, they were placed in one of three levels.
Okay.
There was high achieving group, average achievers, and low achievers. In the college of education, it's typically called a tracking program. So we started in 1970 with that in place, and I don't remember how many years, but at some point that was challenged in court and was done away with.
Now, how would that pan out in terms of the classroom assignments? Would it be that one classroom would be for like track 1, one would be track 2, one would be track 3? Is that the way you did it?
In most of the elementary schools, it would vary, but there were generally somewhere around a dozen classes.
Okay.
And it would pretty well be that a third of them, say 3 or 4, would be the above average achievers, 3 or 4 would be average achievers, and 3 or 4 would be below average achievers.
And so, but they were all in the same classroom?
No. They were all in the same building.
Okay.
But if you went down the hall, say at Sutter School, where I was, this classroom might be a below average group. You go to the next teacher, she might have all above average, the next one might have, but it would be a group of 23 to 27 children who were all assigned to be together because of their score on the achievement test.
Mm-hmm. Now, from your perspective as an educator and an administrator and somebody who had advanced degree in education, did this make sense to you, or how did you think about it?
At the time, I probably thought better of it than I did in latter years. The idea is you can move each group faster if they're pretty much working on the same level. You can concentrate the whole day at that level, and they'll all make gains. It tended not to work out that way, and now I would not propose it at all as a way to do it. but and that's what we did, and that was the Positive
Yeah.
District, and that's the way we did it.
So what else do you remember about the 70s as you, let's see, you spent a while at Sudeth, then you moved to Henderson, then in the 80s you move up to assistant superintendent and
I
superintendent.
spent the entire decade of the 70s at Sudeth. I moved to Henderson in 81, so the whole 11 years I was at Sudeth. You know, it got to be a comfortable place to be, and most of the teachers had been there with me, and we were just having school.
Can you give me a sense of how many teachers did you actually supervise? How many teachers were there at Sudeth?
Generally around 12 to 14 regular teachers, and you had art, music, PE, librarians, special ed, speech therapy. We had some remedial programs funded through Title I. There would be what everybody referred to as a Title I reading teacher, Title I math teacher, cafeteria staff, janitorial staff. So there were probably 25, 28 people and me there.
Yeah, quite a few. And about how many students were at Sudeth?
Most years that would be 325 to 350, something like that.
Well, that's quite a few. Yeah, quite a few. So when you think back on your years, the 70s, you know, over 10 years that you spent at Sudeth, what are your memories? You said it's comfortable. Do you have any other memories of that time and of that job?
You know, there would be the things that always happen in school. Some child's parents killed in a car wreck, or you know, just typical school happenings. As far as any major events related to integrating the schools, no. But there would periodically be and I don't recall a specific, but there would periodically be a family that would come to see me thinking that their child had been mistreated because they were black. I mean, that occurred. But as far as major things, events, no.
Was there any violence? And I ask this because Pam and Rosemary and Carmen had very distinct memories of one or two violent episodes. They had actually been threatened at one point in time in that 1970 year. Do you have any memories of violence or threats of violence in your school from that time?
I remember one gentleman who had a daughter with red hair, brilliant red hair. Some of the black children, it was their first opportunity to be that close to red hair. And they marveled at it. They were curious about it, you know, and it's an opportunity to be right there. And he didn't like that. And I remember him talking as if he was going to do something about it. And I told Mr. Armstrong, the superintendent, and, you know, we were watching for him. In this day and time, it would probably land him in the jail because times are so different, you know. But I assume Mr. Armstrong told the police then. I did not. I just told Mr. Armstrong. But that's the closest I recall of being anything violent.
And had this guy threatened to come to school and do something?
Yeah.
Well, that's good, I guess, that you didn't have anything beyond that. That was enough. And then as superintendent, what was it like being superintendent, and what kind of challenges did you face as superintendent? How did you see Starkville
Well,
school
of course,
system changed.
you've jumped from the 70s to,
I know.
to the 90s
I
now.
I know. Well, you can go back and fill in as you wish. It's no problem.
There were always challenges. The school consolidation issue was an issue throughout the 90s. In fact, it's been an issue off and on since the 60s and 70s. So as an issue that was always there, we were always talking about and meeting about consolidating city and county schools during my time as superintendent was the big one.
Where it was finally it was turned down. Ultimately, I guess it was endorsed and then it was turned down.
We put together a number of plans and all, and none of them were ever brought it about to happen. So I guess turned down and described as good as anything. In terms of big issues, and it's maybe big issues not the way to describe it, but some of the, there are always staff issues where somebody does something you've got to terminate. I don't need to talk about it. It had nothing to do with race at all. And throughout the country, these programs create problems. That just happen. Cheerleaders, homecoming court selection, those type activities from time to time create more unrest than stuff that should count, like what happens in the math class or whatever, and over my period as superintendent, we had an issue come up about why are the cheerleaders at Starkville High predominantly white. We had issues about who gets elected to be the homecoming queen. And that's not to say that's what I had to worry about as superintendent, but in terms of events that caught the public's eye, the newspaper liked to write about and interview about, and that type thing. Those kind of stand out.
And how did they end up getting resolved? How did you handle them?
We ended up cheerleading at Starkville High was never a popularity contest. It was one where you had to try out and be able to tumble and do the routines and all those things. Yeah. And we ended up, and the concern or the feeling among me, the black parents who were talking to me about it was, our children don't have a chance to, in a large scale, of going to gyms and tumbling classes and dance classes and all those things. And so it's not fair. We don't question you're picking the best ones who can do that, but it's just not fair. So we ended up having some cheerleader tryout preparation classes at Starkville High, where anybody want to be a cheerleader, come and we're gonna teach you what you got to do in order to compete in this, and that helped a great deal. It did bring about a cheerleading squad that was more diverse. Now, I've been retired since 2002. Right. Whether they're still doing that, I have no idea.
Right. But they did while you were there.
While I was there, we tried to amend that,
And the homecoming queen, I know from looking at yearbooks that initially the district approached that issue by simply having like parallel, there would be a white and a black. And I don't know how long that went. Do you know how long when did that stop? What happened with that through time?
I'm reasonably sure that happened that they did away with that in the late 80s,
Okay.
I think. I think that had already been done by the time I became superintendent. Which reminds me, for many years after integration, there was no high school prom.
Okay. No problem.
And then in about probably 86, somewhere along in there, we had a principal at Starkville High School named Alan Graham, who moved here from New Orleans. And he came over to the superintendent's office and said, we need to have this doesn't make sense. It's been 15 years since integration. We need to have a high school prom. And in our meetings with him, they decided, let's go for it. So he went back and organized it, and I would think Pam Hunt would have been right in the middle of working on it. I don't know if she talked about it.
We didn't talk about it.
But that was when we started having the high school prom again, and everybody came.
And one big prom.
Yeah.
Yeah. And did it work?
It did. No problems that I recall. It worked. That's good. I assume still going on. Again, it's been since 2002, but I feel comfortable they're still having it.
Mm-hmm. So do you have a sort of, from the perspective of just your personal perspective and also your perspective as a educated administrator, do you have any sense of why things went more smoothly here in terms of integration, desegregation than it did in other places in the state?
Probably the university influence, the attitude that people from all over the country, kind of a melting pot. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that probably had a great deal to do with it. And I'll go ahead and say, in 1970, those teachers who felt real strongly about it, didn't think it was a thing to do. That's when Starkville Academy was created, and a number of teachers left the public schools and went there. And I've always thought if they felt that strongly about it, it probably helped us implement it easier.
Yeah. They essentially opt out.
Right.
Yeah. Which is an interesting read, because a lot of people read the founding of the various academies around the state quite negatively, but it could, as you're suggesting, it could actually in a strange way have positive effects, because it allows the rest of the school system to sort of proceed along.
There's no doubt in my mind that Starkville schools would have been better in 1970 if everybody had wanted to stay and make it work. I mean, my real preference was then and still is, I wish everybody wanted to be together and make it work.
Yeah.
But some of them didn't want that. Mm-hmm. And so I felt like, well, we can make it work better without having that viewpoint included with us. Did
you have any sense of real fear that too many whites would flee to the private academy? The public schools were really under threat? That is always in the back of a public school administrator's mind if they have an academy, because you want to have everybody in the public schools if you're a public schools administrator. And on the other side of that is you sure don't want people to leave. And so yes, that's always a factor. As an administrator, did you have any sense of having any control over that process or any way to influence whether or not people went to the academy? We tried real hard to put programs in place that would draw people to us. Mm-hmm. Orchestra
theater, ROTC. We really work to have programs beyond academics that would make the public schools attractive. We wanted a top-notch academic program, which we had, but we wanted more than that. So we put a lot of emphasis on let's make the public schools very desirable.
And did you have a sense of, I mean, that worked on some levels because the public schools are still going, but did you have a sense of, was there a point in time where you had a sense of relief that you'd sort of survived a challenge, or was this just an ongoing threat through time that Starkville Academy was always over there and you always had to worry about it?
It's always been there.
Yeah. So you had to be very vigilant ultimately. Makes sense. So I know you said I didn't ask about the 80s. What, I guess, at this point, since we've talked for a while, what are some things that you think I need to fill in, or you need to fill in terms of your experience here in Starkville?
We've covered a lot.
What am I missing to a certain extent is my question.
You know, we've covered the two major issues of my 34, 35 years in Starkville schools. Integration and consolidation of the city and county. I mean, those were the two big ones. Yeah. The remainder of it is more or less day-to-day happenings. And if you go back and read all the newspapers for those 34 years, there would be things that I've forgotten that were issued at the time, but they were really small in comparison to integration and school consolidation.
Yeah. And I haven't asked you a lot about the school consolidation. It goes a little bit beyond our project, but a couple people have talked about it. Do you have any sense of why it all failed back in the 90s? It was the early 90s, and then obviously it's taking place now, and obviously now it's been mandated. Do you have any sense of why it failed when it did while you were superintendent?
Starkville, the board and I felt that we were employed by the citizens or I was employed by the citizens of Starkville School District. The board represented them, and we were perfectly willing to plan, talk, discuss school consolidation, but we would not accept anything that we thought would weaken Starkville schools. So that was our viewpoint, and we, every time we would have meetings and talk about it, we made sure we had that part covered before we did anything else. Yeah. The county, on the other hand, I'll give you an example. We worked to consolidate all the high schools in the county. Don't remember the year. I would say probably 1998 or 9, somewhere and I could be off a year or two. But we put together a plan to consolidate all the high schools in the county into Starkville High. The plan in its basic form said that the existing county school would fund the construction of additional classrooms at Starkville High School to house them.
To accommodate.
Starkville, of course, is the district has more wealth. We spend more money per student, all those type things. The plan also said that the county would pay, well, let me back up. Every school district gets money from the state to support schools. So the plan said the county would forward to us all the money that was designated for high school students, and it would be given to the Starkville School District. And state law and accreditation requirements, all those things make it necessary that local tax dollars be spent in addition to what the state provides. At the time we were working on it, in round numbers, Starkville was spending $1,000 per student more than Oktibbeha County. Now, a lot of that was because there was a difference in teacher pay. The city was paying more than the county. We offered wide curriculum, foreign languages, AP courses, all those things that we were doing. So it was costing us about $1,000 per student to run Starkville High School.
Yeah.
So the plan called for the county to pay, in addition to their state money, to pay whatever amount we in the city were paying per student in addition. The county's position about that in the end, we talked about it a lot.
Yeah.
In the end, their position was, we can pay that right now. We can pay that $1,000. Over years, though, it may grow, that amount we got to put in may increase to the point we cannot pay it. So we're not going to enter into this agreement. That was the closest we ever came among ourselves, shall I say, of doing any consolidation.
Right.
There were, I mean, at the time I thought to myself, I think you're making a mistake. If we're out 10 years out and suddenly you can't pay, I don't think Starkville's going to send them back, you know.
No,
but,
exactly.
But anyway,
something would get worked out.
They were very concerned about it and very honest about it. So we may not can pay it in years out in the future. Other issues that this idea of we're got to look out for the interests of Starkville School. We'll consolidate, but we've got to look out for those interests. Other issues were things like state law specified that in a consolidated school district, the superintendent would be selected by the process that was in place for the largest district that was being consolidated. That getting back to the elected versus the appointed superintendents.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So Starkville was by far the larger of the two, so that meant that the superintendent would be an appointed superintendent. And the law went on to say that in a consolidated school district, the school board will be an elected board, with each board member coming from a supervisor's district. The Starkville School Board is an appointed board. The Board of Aldermen appoint them. And then there was, depending on on the percentage of students who live outside the city limits, the Starkville School District was 100 square miles, roughly 10 miles square. And then you had the city of Starkville sitting in the middle of that. The school board was, at least 3 of the school board members were appointed by the Board of Aldermen. And then depending on the percentage, and I've forgotten the number, but depending on the percentage of students who lived in the school district but outside the city limits, there would be an elected board member, or maybe 2 elected board members, depending on how many lived outside the city. In Starkville, there was never enough students outside to elect 2. So the Starkville board for years had been 4 appointed board members and 1 elected board member. If the city and the county were consolidated, then that would change. There would be 5 elected school board members. each one from one of the supervisor districts. Now, the city of Starkville is divided up almost like a pie. If you think about the county and the supervisor districts, they start real wide way out in the county, and then they come into the city and get a portion of the city. So you've divided the city up into those 5 supervisor districts.
Yeah.
There was concern that the board, if it becomes an elected board, would dilute the city voting strength. You know how politics enter into things. Would dilute the city voting strength, and we may not have anybody in the city of Starkville who's on the school board. So that was a concern.
Yeah, because the wide pie slice would be out in the county.
Right.
And it would also make, there was probably a racial component too, because it would be more likely to be African American than white.
Probably not totally, no. And we always had, throughout my time, we had 2 African American board members. We all, the race issue wasn't even talked about. It was, will the city of Starkville still have board members in this consolidated school? And then the third thing was the county has twice been taken into conservatorship, low test scores, those type things, and so much emphasis in the last 20 years has been put on student achievement as measured by the test, and that's the way you determine whether a school district is good or bad.
Yes.
I mean, it's a terrible way to do it to me, but anyway, that's the way it worked. So there was a concern about when you put all the children together, because the county schools were struggling, so will it lower the rating of the Starkville schools?
Mm-hmm.
So we had to work through all that. We had a plan more or less in place to do that. It never got anywhere. But all those issues, were what we discussed throughout my superintendency. Mm-hmm. Now, the current consolidation was brought about by an act of the legislature. But a host of the issues that Starkville was concerned about were part of the law that was passed. The board member issue was that Starkville doesn't have to have, that was 5 elected board members.
Right.
They've been granted a number of years, and I'm not sure how many, exemption from getting a bad rating on achievement. You know, that a lot of the things that were impediments to consolidation were put in that bill that consolidated the schools, and that's helped tremendously to keep the people of Starkville from being unhappy.
Yeah, rebelling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think, well, obviously this time it has to succeed because it's been mandated.
Right. And it, from all what I know from just being out in the public and what I know from being told from the inside, it's working about as well as it could be hoped for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's good. I mean,
that is
that's
good.
good.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of time, but I thought maybe we could wrap up by talking a little bit about how is Starkville, or how did, I guess first of all, how did Starkville change over the course of time that you worked as a teacher and a school administrator? What were some of the most notable things, I guess, just thinking about the schools this time, what were some of the biggest changes that you saw happen from the late 60s until your retirement in 2002?
Well, the town obviously got bigger, schools got bigger, everything was bigger. Mm-hmm. More money available to do things. When I was at Starkville High School, you had to have 16 Carnegie units to graduate. from high school. Now you have to have 20 some odd. I've lost count of what it is, but it's way up in the 20s. So we expect a whole lot more out of students than we did. The curriculum's much broader. So all of that's good. I mean, it's just a lot more opportunity available now than there was when I was a student or in my early days of working here. Probably a notable change, and it's not in Starkville, but I think countrywide, just the way I'm searching for the word I want to use here, but there's been a change in parental attitude. When I was in school and when I first started teaching, if a child got in trouble at school, they were in trouble at home. By the time I retired, they may be in trouble at home, but the parents were going to do a lot of checking and making sure that the child wasn't being mistreated. And that happened often enough that I saw it as a change in parental attitude. That just because you get in trouble at school now doesn't mean you're going to get in trouble at home. Your mom and daddy are going to really dig into it and make sure before they think the child's at fault. Now, is that good or bad? I won't pass judgment, but I saw that change, and as you know, when you talk about large groups of people, there's always an exception, but in general, that attitude shift occurred during my almost 40 years in it.
Yeah. And now just thinking sort of personally, how have you, as a person who's lived in Starkville for a long time, how have you seen the town change overall? Has it changed? I mean, you can also say it hasn't changed.
I don't know that it's changed a lot. I mean, like I said, there's more of it, you know. But it's always been a great place. And if you pick any period in time, as long as I've been here, it's been a great place to live and be. And it's different because of things that come along, opportunities, but it's just always been a good place.
And are there any things that, any other things you want to add to the interview that we haven't talked about that, again, I don't know to ask or that I've forgotten to ask that are important to you? Okay, well then I'll stop there. We've been talking for almost a good hour and a half. Well, thank you. All right.
Are you still looking for people to talk to?
We are. We are.